That's not to say that you can't go out there and fight for anything. What that's saying is that if you're fighting for a system, whether it's a government, whether it's a religion, or whether it's a marriage, and you simply get to the place where you're just tired and you don't understand why it's not working, that you need to get to a place where you just need to move on from that. Build something different, build something new. You're not giving up, you're not laying there at night feeling sorry for yourself. There's sorrow and there's grief said to not do anything, but rather to build something new. Then you need to be realistic sometimes and realize that the thing that you're grieving may not have actually existed to begin with, and it could help you push forward for something new and better. So I wanted to make this quick little video here. I've been thinking about a lot of things the last while. Sometimes we have these pictures in our head of what something is going to be like. You know, maybe in your marriage, or even in your belief of in your country and what it stands for. Like, we can take something like a marriage, for instance, where you believe that when you get married and you get into this relationship, like, you have this idea of what you want in life. Hopefully both of you are pretty much in agreement on that. And you know, you may want to have a life such as, like, on, you know, a couple acres where you can have some fences with some chickens and some animals on it, and you want to be able to have a nice green lawn. You have this image of, you know, your kids playing out in the yard, you know, and you just have these nice ideas in your head of what life should be like, right? Look at this guy. Well, hi, baby groundhog. Hi, buddy. How cute is that? Guess I wasn't loud enough coming in here, huh? I'm shocked. The little guy sat there for that long. But anyways, so that's taken like a marriage, you know, they're fighting for this ideology of what you want your life to be, and you're fighting, you know, for that one thing. You know, you finally, you know, you end up buying the property, you end up having the house, and you have the kids. Now the kids are getting older, you know, some of them are getting, you know, way outside of the little baby phase. You know, they're turning into teenagers and little humans, and you know, you have a good life, but you don't necessarily have that life that you had envisioned, and you realize that you're not necessarily happy. Maybe your partner isn't really happy either. And you find out, like, if you really sit and you think about it, what you've been fighting for has been an illusion, and you've been fighting for something that isn't real, that doesn't exist, or that hasn't existed in your life. You start saying, at what point in time do I just kind of, you know, say that I'm fighting for something here that isn't necessarily real? And it hasn't existed in this situation. It hasn't existed with this set of systems. It hasn't, you know, existed in this relationship or whatever. What you want isn't necessarily bad, but, you know, a lot of times when you get to this point where you realize that there needs to be some serious consideration on whether this is going to work or not, you have to sit there and think, and you have to realize that what you're actually grieving is an idea. You're not grieving anything real, because what you're grieving, that perfect picture of a family spending, this beautiful time together, working together in, the flower beds, going on picnics, going to the beach. If you've been fighting for that, but every time you and your family try to do that, something happens where one person or the other is frustrated, the kids are whiny, and you realize that all these things that you both try to do, it's not that one is a bad person. It's not that you don't even love each other or respect each other. But you just start realizing that we've been fighting for this thing. We kind of seem to have different ideas on how to get to the same end result or whatever, and it's just not jiving, it's just not meshing, it's just not coming together. And through not one person in particular's fault, it's just not working. And you start really realizing that these things that you're, like I said, like that you're fighting for, that you're trying to get towards, that you're trying to achieve, the idea behind it is not bad. It's actually good. But yet at the same time in your life, because either you or your partner are just simply not meant for each other, the chemistry is just not right, take it on a national level, maybe the policies, that are in place and the systems that we've been using, the type of governments, the corporations, all the things at play, and the humans involved, that it's just not working. We have this good idea of we want as a nation, but when you look at the history of the nation, how it got to where it's at now, how we built this country on the backs of other people, and that what you believe you're fighting for and what you believe you're trying to create for this country doesn't actually exist. It hasn't existed. We've fought for so long to have this idealistic existence of a country, this kind of nation and governmental system to just beat out everything else that is supposed to be, this trickle-down economy, and if everybody works hard, you can have this awesome living and kind of this stress-free life, but yet you kind of see people struggling endlessly in this almost nightmarish way, just trying to exist. And you realize that, and I know that some of this has to be historically brought into context in some ways, but in some ways you also have to see that, our founding fathers even had this idealistic view of a nation and of freedom, all the while enslaving another group of people. So has the United States, or any nation out there for that matter, actually had the existence that they say they're fighting for? It just really makes you wonder how much of our life that we're actually fighting for and trying to achieve, how much of it is just an illusion? Does it actually exist? And if you're sitting there thinking that you're fighting for the United States, what are you actually fighting for? And does the version of the United States that you're fighting for even exist? Has it ever existed? I think if we would ask ourselves those honest questions, we have so many people that are willing to go fight and die for this country, and to say that, we have the best thing going, and yet at the same time, this land of the free, like, does it actually exist? Has it ever existed? And I think we can easily answer that and say no. Because the version of the United States that I grew up with believing that we had, what we thought the United States stood for, and what we could all have as Americans, doesn't actually exist. Like, it's just not there. It's just not there. And so a lot of times when we have a hard time, like, we want to kick back against it. Maybe you're grieving a separation, with your spouse, and there are kids involved in it, or you want to kind of kick back against somebody talking about the United States the way that I am, and you kind of have this knee-jerk reaction, or you're grieving kind of a loss. What are you grieving? Are you may be grieving something that could have been, technically, like in a marriage. Maybe for some people, the lifestyle that I was describing, where it's kind of this utopian family life where both parents are very happy, the children are extremely happy, and everybody's just happy, having a good old time. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist for anybody, but if it doesn't exist for you, and yet you're like kicking back on the idea of like separating, and you're like really grieving it hard, and you're heartbroken, are you actually grieving something real? Or are you grieving something that could have been, that you wanted to have but doesn't actually exist? So you may actually, it helped me see it more clearly when I realized that I most of the time am grieving an ideology that doesn't actually exist. I want something that is good, and to see the hopes and the dreams of having something like that, kind of come apart, that is something to be grieved. Like, that is real, but those are about the only real things in it. And you have to realize that what you're grieving is something that never existed to begin with. Not saying there shouldn't be any grief or sorrow. Like I said, those hopes, those dreams, those aspirations, what your heart wants, what you thought you were going to build, what you thought you were going to have in this stage of life, to just get there and realize that it needs, it's all coming apart, that you need to separate, that you need, you either need to separate from a spouse, or that the country that you thought you were fighting so hard for doesn't actually really exist. That idea that you thought you were fighting for may have been good, may have been right, but it wasn't actually there. It was just the idea of it. There's an idea. We're all fighting for this idea of what we want, not realizing that what we're fighting for doesn't actually exist and never actually existed. That's not to say that you can't go out there and fight for anything. What that's saying is that if you're fighting for a system, whether it's a government, whether it's a religion, or whether it's a marriage, and you simply get to the place where you're just tired and you don't understand why it's not working, and you realize that you need to get to a place where you just need to move on from that, build something different, build something new. You're not giving up. You're not laying there at night feeling sorry for yourself. There's sorrow and there's grief, and you're not realizing that it needs to come apart, like I said, to not do anything, but rather to build something new. Then you need to be realistic sometimes and realize that the thing that you're grieving may not have actually existed to begin with, and it can help you push forward for something new and better. If I look at that with my nationalism, and I realize that our systems and our government and everything that we have are just simply broken, And when I look back at the horrible, crazy history that we had, and I'm not saying that we're worse than any other country, you can argue for or against that. I'm not trying to get into any of that. It's just simply realizing that why am I fighting for something, trying to keep something alive that's on, like, it's not even on life support. It literally hasn't even existed yet. And we're sitting here fighting for something and mourning something that never, I don't know how to put it any other way, it just never existed. It's as simple as that. The United States that most people are fighting for, that they're getting so bent out of shape for, that they believe they're defending, never existed. It was just an idea. And at what point in time are we going to sit there and seriously realize maybe this just isn't working? Maybe we need something different. Maybe we need to get a disillusion from this marriage to a economical, governmental system that just hasn't worked. The ideas were good. It sounds good when you say the Pledge of Allegiance, when you initially look at the Constitution. Those things are not really bad, but what they're stating and what a lot of people think that we have, it was never there. It was an idea. And is an idea worth spending the rest of your life on? What you're defending, this idea. We fight for, like, this idea of America. We fight for it, some people literally to the death. An idea is not worth giving your life for. It's not. It's not worth devoting your life to if it doesn't work. You are allowed to say, this ain't working. We've tried, we've given it our best shot. We put everything into it that we can. But right now, all of our time, money, energy, resources are being invested just to keep this thing alive. And it's just time to let it go. Plain and simple. I think that's where we are as a nation, and I think a lot of people are there at that place in a bunch of different ways. We see a lot of people calling it quits in a lot of different areas. And I think it's a good thing. I think more people need to do that. Anyways, quit fighting and giving your life for something that doesn't exist. Have a good one.